My name is Keth Sub-Analyst 3rd Tier, Vorrethian Directorate, Cascade Intelligence Division. This is my after-action report for Cascade Operation Vethmora 9, filed on the 240th rotation following the conclusion of active dispersal operations. I am filing it now because, for the previous 239 rotations, I did not know how to write it. There is no standard form for this category of outcome. I have been writing and discarding drafts since the day we withdrew from the system. This is the draft I am submitting. I will try to be accurate. Accuracy is the only thing I have to offer. The Vorrethian Directorate has been seeding worlds for 400 standard cycles. We are not conquerors in the traditional sense. That word implies armies, sieges, the wasteful exchange of violence for territory. We are more efficient than that, or we had believed ourselves to be. We identify a target world, classify its dominant biology, engineer a cascade seed calibrated to that biology's specific cellular architecture, and we deploy it from orbit. The seeding takes between 30 and 90 standard rotations depending on atmospheric density and biome spread. When it is finished, the world's dominant species has been converted, not destroyed, simply altered at the base level so that they no longer resist occupation, and the Directorate's forward teams land to begin the administrative absorption. We had done this 47 times before Vethmora 9. I want to explain what the Directorate knew about Vethmora 9 before we began, because understanding what we knew makes what followed comprehensible, or at least places the failure in its proper context. The Xenobiology Assessment Bureau classified Vethmora 9 as a Class 17 world on the standard Heathrack scale. That classification carries a specific meaning. Class 17 means biologically hostile. The native ecosystem produces toxins, pathogens, and apex predators at densities that would sterilize most seeded colonies within a generation. The Directorate does not typically target Class 17 worlds. The investment of engineering a cascade seed, robust enough to function in that kind of chemical environment, is substantial. And the administrative overhead of landing teams on a world where the local flora can strip a Vorrethian's outer tegument in less than a standard hour is, frankly, not worth it when Class 9 and Class 11 worlds exist in the same sector. I want to say something about that framing, because I think it matters for understanding everything that follows. The Heathrack scale is a measure of ecological hostility to Vorrethian biology specifically. Class 17 means the environment is dangerous to us. It does not mean, and it was never designed to mean, anything about how the environment relates to the species that evolved there. We were using a scale designed to describe the world's danger to ourselves, and applying it as though it also described the world's effect on its dominant species. Those are not the same thing. A world that is hostile to visiting Vorrethians because it evolved to be hostile to most biology is not, for that reason, populated by a species that is struggling to survive in it. The species that evolved on that world is precisely the species that survived when everything was trying to kill it, for as long as anything has been alive on that planet. The Class 17 designation told us the world was dangerous. It did not tell us what the world's own species had become as a consequence of living in it for 400,000 cycles. I am noting this here because I want the record to reflect that this conceptual error was not mine or Director Vorrethian specifically. It was structural. It was built into the tool we used to assess the target, and it had never been exposed before because we had never previously targeted a Class 17 world. The 47 prior operations ran on worlds rated Class 6 through Class 14. None of them had produced a species for which the world's hostility was a foundational feature of the species' own biology, rather than a hazard they endured in spite of their biology. Vethmora 9 was an exception because of its dominant species. The assessment teams had been watching the planet for 60 cycles. The species in question, the Directorate cataloged them under designation HIV. were tool users, bipedal, oxygen-breathing, warm-blooded, and remarkably thin on the ground relative to the planet's surface area. The Assessment Bureau's xenosociologists estimated the global population at somewhere between 8 and 9 billion individuals, which sounds substantial until you understand that Vethmora 9 has a habitable surface area roughly 4 times the galactic average for a Class 7 world, and that the HIV population density in most regions was sparse enough that the planet's apex predators had never been seriously challenged for territorial dominance outside of certain specific biome zones. The HIV had infrastructure, roads, atmospheric craft, rudimentary orbital capability, electronic communication grids, some fission-based energy production, transitioning to other sources. They were, by every standard metric the Assessment Bureau applied, a mid-tier tool species in late industrial phase, technologically capable enough to be aware they were not alone in the galaxy, but not yet capable enough to do anything meaningful about it. The Directorate had watched their orbital program with some interest. Their first crewed deep space probe had been launched 19 cycles prior, and was still outbound at a speed that would take it 1,400 more cycles to reach the nearest inhabited system, and had concluded they posed no near-term threat to the Directorate or to Directorate interests. The reason Vethmora 9 was selected over easier targets was its mineral wealth. The planet's interior had exceptional concentrations of Veth-series heavy metals that the Directorate's shipbuilding apparatus required and could not easily source elsewhere in that sector. The seeding, the conversion, the administrative absorption, all of it was infrastructure investment. The HIV were incidental to the operation's purpose. Once converted, they would be useful as a labor base. Before conversion, they were a bureaucratic obstacle to be processed through the standard mechanism. I had processed that bureaucratic obstacle 46 times before, in 46 prior operations. I expected the 47th to be unremarkable. The Cascade seed for Vethmora 9 took 11 cycles to engineer. I was part of the calibration team, not the primary engineering staff. My role was analytical, tracking the calibration model against the Assessment Bureau's biological data and flagging any divergence from projections. We worked from biological samples the assessment drones had collected over several decades, cellular tissue recovered from shed material, atmospheric particulates, water samples from surface sources, and a small amount of directly collected organic material from the few reconnaissance missions that had touched down in the planet's more remote biome zones. We built a spore conversion agent tuned specifically to the HIV cellular architecture. The conversion mechanism was standard, refined across 47 operations into something we considered highly reliable. The spores bind to the host's nervous system at the synaptic junction layer. They alter the chemical signaling environment around the key compliance and resistance neural pathways. Over the course of approximately 30 rotations, as the agent reaches sufficient tissue saturation, the host's behavioral cortex is restructured. Resistance responses are suppressed, compliance responses are amplified. The host retains its biological functions, its labor capability, motor skills, sensory capacity, basic problem-solving ability. It simply stops resisting. More precisely, it stops wanting to resist. The conversion is not painful, not debilitating. The converted individual continues to function. They just function differently. We had done this 47 times, 47 worlds. The calibration model had been refined across those 47 operations into something the senior engineering staff described, with justifiable pride, as the most sophisticated biological conversion tool in the known galaxy. I had read the technical specifications. I had participated in the calibration. I believed this description was accurate. I still believe it was accurate. The Cascade seed was exactly what the engineering staff said it was. The problem was not the tool. We launched the Cascade on the 22nd rotation of cycle 441. 40,000 atmospheric delivery units, deployed from 3 dispersal platforms in low orbit, carrying a combined spore payload sufficient to saturate Vorrethian atmosphere to conversion concentration within 11 standard rotations. The delivery was textbook. I monitored the atmospheric spread from the Cascade intelligence platform and filed my initial dispersal confirmation within the hour. Wind current modeling was accurate. Stratospheric distribution matched projected curves within 2%. The payload fragmentation pattern matched the engineering team's pre-launch models almost exactly. We were on schedule. I noted in my opening operation log, Cascade Vorrethian initiated on schedule. Atmospheric saturation proceeding nominally. Conversion window projected at 72 rotations from full saturation. I sent that log to Director Vorrethian. He returned it with a single notation, confirmed, continue monitoring. I continued monitoring. The conversion window was projected at 72 rotations from full atmospheric saturation. We expected the first behavioral suppression signals, reduced communications traffic, cessation of defensive posturing, compliance markers from any converted individuals interacting with our preliminary ground sensor network, around rotation 40. By rotation 60, we expected widespread conversion across the mid-density population zones. By rotation 72, the planet was to be ready for administrative team landing. On rotation 23, something unexpected happened. The HIV noticed. I want to be careful about what I mean by that, because it is easy in retrospect to say that and give it more weight than it had at the time. Species noticed the onset of seeding. Most species with any sensory capability detect some signal of the atmospheric change, a shift in light diffusion, a chemical presence their respiratory apparatus registers, some visible or tactile evidence of the delivery units. It is stage 1 of the standard conversion response profile. It is expected. It passes. What I mean when I say the HIV noticed is something more specific. Within 18 hours of the atmospheric spore concentration reaching the lower atmospheric bands where HIV respiratory exposure would begin, their communication networks showed a coordinated alarm response that was broader, faster, and more immediately analytical than anything in the stage 1 documentation I had reviewed. Not just alarm spreading through a population in the way fear signals propagate through a social species. Alarm propagating through a population that had institutional structures purpose-built to receive and process alarm signals, and those structures activating immediately, with what appeared to be practiced efficiency, as though they had a protocol for this and were executing it. I noted it in my rotation log as HIV alert response to atmospheric anomaly, consistent with projected stage 1 behavioral signature, conversion not yet initiated, monitoring for suppression onset. I filed that log. My superior, Cascade Intelligence Director Vorrethian, reviewed it and concurred. We expected the alert response. I told myself we expected the alert response, and I believed that. And I was not wrong to believe it because alert responses are stage 1, and stage 1 passes. On rotation 27, the HIV communications traffic shifted. It did not decrease, which would have indicated early conversion onset, the behavioral suppression beginning to take hold. It changed character, less alarm signaling, more of what I can only describe based on the translation system's partial rendering as methodical information exchange. Scientific traffic, the Bureau's analysis systems flagged. The HIV scientific and medical institutional networks were exchanging high volumes of structured data, the pattern consistent with rapid collaborative analysis of a specific problem. The traffic was not random or panicked. It had the signature of organized work. I noted that in my log as well. HIV scientific community mobilizing to analyze atmospheric agent, conversion stage 1 delayed, No suppression markers yet visible. Projected suppression onset adjusted to rotation 35. Director Vorrethian reviewed that log. He told me to adjust my projections and continue monitoring. I continued monitoring. On rotation 29, the translation systems gave me a partial rendering of a broadcast the HIV were running across what appeared to be their global public communication network. It was an address of some kind, delivered by what the Bureau's behavioral analysis team assessed as a high-status institutional voice, one of the leading figures in their medical science establishment, speaking to the general population through their mass communication channels. The rendering was partial, large blocks of it untranslatable at our current HIV language modeling depth, but some sections came through clearly enough. I have retained the translation log. The relevant passage reads, "We are analyzing the source and composition of the atmospheric agent. The response framework is the same one we have used for novel biological threats across the past untranslatable duration. Our untranslatable institutional name, laboratories are working at full capacity. We expect to have preliminary composition data within untranslatable time unit. The untranslatable institutional name network has been activated globally. We have seen this kind of thing before. The response is the same. We identify it, we model it, we counter it." I want to be precise about what I understood when I read that translation, because I think the precision matters and because I believe, looking back, that this was the moment when the outcome of the operation was already settled, and we simply didn't know it yet. The phrase, "the response is the same," is what occupied me. In my experience of monitoring pre-conversion species, alarm broadcasts are variable. They are shaped by the specific nature of the threat. An aerial predator produces one kind of broadcast, a food shortage produces another, an unknown chemical anomaly in the atmosphere produces a third. The variable quality of the alarm is informative. It tells you what the species recognizes and what it doesn't, and a species encountering a truly novel threat typically produces a broadcast that sounds novel as well, with the particular character of something that does not have a protocol yet. I had listened to, or rather processed translations of, a great many alarm phase broadcasts across 47 operations. This one did not sound like a species encountering something novel. It sounded like a species executing a protocol. The explicit reference to a known response framework, the stated expectation of preliminary results within a defined time window, all of these were the marks of an institution telling its population not that it had a plan, but that the plan was already running, that it had been running since they first detected the anomaly, that the plan was practiced and they trusted it. I have been in government service for 30 cycles. I know what a practiced emergency protocol sounds like when it is activated. That broadcast was not the sound of improvisation. It was the sound of a practiced emergency protocol being activated by a population that had activated it before and expected it to work again because it always had. I flagged this translation to Director Vorrethian with a note that the phrase, "we have seen this kind of thing before," was, in my assessment, operationally significant. Aachen acknowledged the flag and told me to continue monitoring. I continued monitoring. On rotation 31, the first ground sensor we had placed on the surface, a passive environmental unit disguised as a geological feature, planted by a drone 3 cycles before the Cascade launch, was interfered with. Not destroyed. Interfered with. Something had been placed over it that disrupted its transmission signal. When I reviewed the sensor imagery from before the interference, I found that the object placed over the sensor was a transparent enclosure containing several small devices the Bureau's analysis team tentatively identified as HIV atmospheric sampling apparatus. They had found our sensor. They had not smashed it. They had put a laboratory around it. I want to stay on that detail for a moment, because in the context of what followed it matters. a species encountering an unknown object on their world during what they had already identified as a biological anomaly event has a range of possible responses. They could destroy it, threat response, eliminate the unknown. They could leave it, avoidance response, don't touch what you don't understand. They could collect it and examine it later, security response, remove the unknown from the environment. Any of those responses would have been consistent with the stage 1 through 3 conversion response profiles in the Directorate's documentation. They put a laboratory around it. They wanted to study it in situ. They wanted to understand what it was doing in the field, in context, with their sampling instruments positioned to capture whatever it was emitting or measuring or transmitting. They were not just curious. They were methodical about their curiosity. I flagged this to Director Vorrethian as a high-priority anomaly. He acknowledged the flag and told me it was consistent with the HIV's known tendency toward investigative behavior and did not indicate conversion compromise. He told me the conversion clock had been extended to 110 rotations on the basis of a Class-17 biological complexity correction factor. I wrote in my log, HIV investigative activity around ground sensor suggests high-function analytical response persisting beyond projected stage 1 duration. Conversion onset not yet confirmed. Monitoring continues. Then I wrote below that entry, in a notation I flagged as personal analysis and did not submit through official channels. The HIV are not behaving like a species in the early stages of behavioral suppression. They are behaving like a species that has encountered a problem it intends to solve. The distinction is operationally meaningful. A species being suppressed becomes gradually less organized. A species solving a problem becomes progressively more organized. The HIV communications traffic is more organized now than it was on rotation 23. It continues to organize. I did not submit that notation. I should have submitted it. The reason I didn't was that I was a sub-analyst 3rd tier, and the person who needed to act on it was a Cascade Intelligence Director. And the standard operational culture of the Directorate does not encourage sub-analysts 3rd tier to tell intelligence directors that their operation is categorically different from all previous operations based on a qualitative observation about communications traffic patterns. I told myself I would submit it if I had harder data. I went back to monitoring. On rotation 35, we lost ground sensor contact across approximately 30% of the northern continental network. The losses were clustered, not random, which would indicate environmental interference, but geographically organized, which indicated systematic recovery. HIV recovery teams, operating with apparent prior knowledge of the general sensor placement logic, were working through the network in a pattern I could only describe as a sweep. They were finding sensors that were not designed to be findable by a mid-tier technological species, and they were finding them at a rate that suggested they had a model of where to look. The Assessment Bureau's technical team said the sensor finding rate was impossible given the concealment specifications. The concealment specifications had been designed and tested against the HIV sensor technology baseline as established from intelligence gathered before the operation. The HIV sensor technology baseline, however, had been established 2 cycles before the operation. 2 cycles is not a long time in Vorrethian terms. The Assessment Bureau established technology baselines on a standard 2-cycle review cycle. I noted, in a formal report this time, that the HIV had in those 2 cycles demonstrated the capacity to perform rapid targeted technological development in response to a detected threat, and that the sensor finding capability they were currently displaying was likely not something they had possessed 2 cycles ago, but something they had developed or adapted in the 23 rotations since detecting the atmospheric anomaly. I want to add something to this that I did not put in the formal report, because formal reports are not the appropriate vehicle for this kind of observation, but this document is meant to be complete. What the HIV sensor recovery teams were doing was not just finding the sensors. I watched the orbital footage very carefully, and there was a quality to their methodology that I found, and still find, difficult to look away from. They were not using a brute force sweep, not covering every square unit of surface area until they happened upon each sensor. They were using inference. They would stop at a location, take atmospheric and ground surface readings with their portable equipment, and then move with confidence in a specific direction to find the next one. They were reading the environment the sensors were embedded in, and inferring sensor position from the environmental signatures. Sensors that had been in place for 3 cycles. In an environment the HIV had not been scanning for sensors before rotation 23. In 12 standard rotations of active searching, they had reverse-engineered enough of our placement logic to make reliable locational inferences. I don't know what to call that other than fast. I submitted that report. It was logged, acknowledged, and marked for review. On rotation 38, we should have been seeing widespread conversion onset. We were not. The planet was louder than it had been at the start of the operation, in every sense my monitoring instruments could measure. HIV communications traffic was 3 times the pre-operation baseline. Their atmospheric transit systems were operating at maximum recorded frequency. The institutional gathering points, universities, medical facilities, research installations, showed thermal and energy signatures consistent with around-the-clock maximum capacity operation. The agricultural and industrial systems that would have shown the first quieting effects of behavioral suppression were operating normally. The creative and social transmission networks that conversion typically reduced first, the signals that corresponded to HIV leisure and cultural activity, were, if anything, running above normal. Conversion onset was not visible anywhere on the planet. I submitted a formal priority 2 anomaly report on rotation 39. I wrote, conversion onset not observed as of rotation 39, 17 rotations after full atmospheric saturation. HIV behavioral profile shows no suppression markers. Subject population is exhibiting elevated analytical and institutional activity inconsistent with any documented conversion response. Recommend recalibration assessment. Director Vorrethian responded within the hour. He told me the conversion clock had already been extended and that the elevated HIV activity was consistent with a pre-suppression alarm phase that sometimes extended longer in biologically robust species. He told me to continue monitoring and to resubmit if I observed suppression markers. I went back to my station. I continued monitoring. And on rotation 44, the atmospheric sensor data showed something that took me 3 full analysis cycles to understand. Because the first 2 times I ran it, I assumed there was a sensor error. The spore concentration in the lower atmosphere was declining. Not dispersing, dispersal would show a different pattern, a thinning distributed evenly across atmospheric layers as the seed spread out and became dilute over time. This was a different pattern entirely. The spores were being removed, actively, selectively, specifically from the altitude bands where HIV respiratory exposure was highest. The concentration in the upper atmosphere was stable. The concentration in the near-surface atmosphere was dropping, and the rate of drop was consistent with a removal mechanism that was accelerating, not leveling off. I ran the sensor data 6 more times. Then I ran it against the archived atmospheric samples from the operation's first days to confirm I was reading the correct baseline. Then I cross-checked the sensor calibration logs to rule out instrument drift. Then I sat at my station for a long time without writing anything. I want to describe what that pause was because it was not a failure of analytical process. I had my answer. The data was clear. The pause was the time it took me to understand that if the data was correct, Then the entire operational framework I had been working inside for 30 cycles was based on a category error. And the category error had been sitting undetected in the Directorate's institutional foundations since before the Heathrex scale was formalized. That is not a small thing to understand at your monitoring station at the end of a routine shift. The HIV were removing the spores from their own atmosphere. Not with any technology I could identify. There was no relevant energy signature, no atmospheric processing activity, no deployment of chemical counteragents at the scale required to produce this effect. The removal was biological. Something in the near-surface atmospheric ecology was consuming the conversion agent. And whatever was consuming it was demonstrably increasing in abundance and activity with each passing rotation, spreading across the planet's surface in a distribution pattern that tracked the HIV's institutional network. Densest near the major research centers, thinning out in the population-sparse biome zones, but spreading outward and accelerating as it spread. I submitted a Priority 1 anomaly report on rotation 44. I included the raw atmospheric data, my analysis methodology, the cross-check results ruling out sensor error, and the following concluding paragraph. The decline in near-surface spore concentration cannot be attributed to natural dispersal, atmospheric chemistry, or any documented environmental neutralization process. The pattern is consistent with active biological consumption of the cascade agent by a microbiological ecosystem that has been calibrated to the agent's chemical signature and deployed at scale across the planetary surface. Given that the cascade agent was derived from HIV cellular architecture, and that the HIV have demonstrated consistent high-speed analytical response since first exposure, I assess it as probable that the HIV biological immune response, operating at the individual, population, and potentially ecosystem level, has identified the conversion agent as a hostile foreign agent and is in the process of mobilizing a systemic counter-response. I am not aware of any precedent for this in the Directorate's operational history. I am recommending immediate suspension of the cascade operation and convening of a full xenobiology assessment board review before any further action is taken. Director Vorrethian did not respond to that report for 2 full rotations. When he did respond, he convened a command session on the primary bridge of the Cascade Intelligence platform. I attended in person. The bridge occupied a glass-domed chamber on the upper level of the platform, oriented to give a clear view of Vethmora 9 below. A large world, mostly blue at this viewing distance, with the brown-gold landmasses of the largest continent visible through cloud cover, and the thin, bright arc of the upper atmosphere catching the light from the local star at the terminator line. It was, under any other circumstances, a beautiful view. The kind of view that the Directorate's promotional materials used to illustrate the scope and reach of the operation. The command session included Director Vorrethian, the 3 Cascade operation leads, the senior xenobiologist on the platform, Researcher Prime Vorrethian, one of the Directorate's most decorated biological engineers, 600 cycles of field experience, and myself. I presented my atmospheric data. I presented my analysis. I explained the complete timeline of anomalous observations from rotation 23 through 44. I was thorough and I was accurate, and I spoke for longer than sub-analysts 3rd tier typically speak in command sessions. Researcher Prime Vorrethian listened to my entire presentation without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me 3 specific questions. What was the chemical signature of the depleting spore fraction relative to the stable upper atmosphere fraction? What was the exact rate of concentration decline, and was the rate itself changing? And had I observed any geographic correlation between regions showing advanced spore depletion and any specific category of HIV institutional activity? I gave her the data on the first 2 questions. The depleting fraction showed higher concentrations of the seed's primary binding agent, the most biologically active component, the part calibrated to interact with HIV neural tissue. The rate of decline was increasing. It had been 2% per rotation at rotation 44 and was 3.7% per rotation by the time I was standing in that room on rotation 46. On the third question, I told her that the regions showing the most advanced spore depletion were uniformly the regions with the highest concentration of HIV medical and research institutions. Vorrethian was quiet for a moment after I said that. Then she said, with the particular flatness of a scientist arriving at a conclusion she had been hoping to avoid, they didn't just tolerate the exposure, they learned from it. She explained the mechanism to the command session. I will try to reproduce her explanation accurately because what she described is, I believe, the most important thing the Directorate has ever failed to account for in 400 cycles of cascade operations. The HIV immune system, she said, does not simply repel foreign biological agents. It records them. It constructs a molecular model of every hostile agent it encounters at the cellular level, stores that model in a distributed biological memory system that persists across the organism's lifetime, and deploys targeted counteragents derived from that model when the same or a similar threat is encountered again. This mechanism was not unknown to the Directorate. It appears in the Xenobiology Assessment Bureau's Biological Threat Evaluation for Class-17 worlds as a standard adaptive immune function. What the evaluation does not capture, because the evaluation was designed for Class 7 and Class 9 worlds, is the degree to which a Class 17 world can develop and refine this mechanism in its dominant species over 400,000 cycles of continuous operation. The HIV immune systems, Vorrethian said, were not average examples of adaptive immunity. They were exceptional examples, honed by 400,000 cycles of continuous warfare against microscopic threats in one of the most biologically hostile environments in the catalogued galaxy. Their immune systems did not just model and remember foreign agents. They shared those models across individuals through their social and medical systems. The mechanism of this sharing, transferring the immune memory from one organism to others who had not been directly exposed, was something the HIV had formalized and scaled into a systematic procedure. Every major disease their civilization had faced in the past 200 of their own calendar cycles had been countered not just by letting it spread through the population until enough survivors carried immunity, but by extracting the immunity from the early survivors and distributing it, deliberately and at institutional scale, to the rest. They had a word for this procedure. Their medical literature used it throughout. She had the translation systems render it as vaccination. The word derives from something in their ancient history that she did not have time to fully explain in that session. The important thing, she said, was that they had been doing it for 200 cycles of their own calendar, against every significant novel biological threat they had encountered in that time. They were practiced at it to a degree we had not measured for, because we had not been looking for it, because the worlds we usually seeded were not Class 17 worlds, and the species on those worlds had not spent 400,000 cycles building exactly this capability. She paused after saying that. The command session was quiet. Vorrethian continued. The species had not simply counterdosed their own population, she said. They had gone further. The microbiological ecosystem they had established in the near-surface atmosphere, the organisms consuming the cascade agent, were not naturally occurring species amplified to perform this function. They were engineered organisms, modified from existing microbial stock, given a metabolic pathway specifically calibrated to break down the cascade agent's primary binding component, and then released into the atmospheric ecology at scale. The HIV had not just vaccinated their population. They had vaccinated their atmosphere. The command session absorbed this. I watched Director Vorrethian's expression across the table. He had the look of a person performing calculations he did not want to perform. He asked what options remained. Vorrethian said we had two. We could deploy a second-generation seed engineered to bypass the counteragent response, but that would require a minimum of a new calibration cycle, and by the time the new seed was ready, the HIV's research institutions would have had time to identify and counter the updated agent as well. The race would favor them, not us, because they were already running it and we were not. Or we could transition to a conventional military suppression approach, circumventing the biological operation entirely. Vorrethian, the military coordination lead, walked through the requirements for the second option with care. A conventional suppression force would be operating on a Class-17 world against a species with 8 billion individuals, functional global communications, atmospheric transit capability, full situational awareness of our operation's existence, and a demonstrated institutional response structure that had shown it could identify, analyze, and neutralize a novel threat faster than the Directorate had engineered it. The force he had requested on Rotation 52 was sized for a standard Class 9 suppression operation. It had not been upscaled. It was 11 rotations out. At the rate Vorrethian was projecting, the counteragent distribution would be approaching 90% of the HIV population by the time those assets arrived. At 90% counterdose saturation, the cascade agent's conversion efficiency would be effectively zero. The window was already gone. We had simply not watched it close. Nobody said the operation had failed. Nobody submitted a formal recommendation to abort. Director Vorrethian gave the order to continue monitoring, to maintain the military asset request as a contingency, and to continue atmospheric dispersal. He closed the command session. I went back to my station. I continued monitoring. On Rotation 51, I observed HIV ground teams moving toward our sensor network positions across 3 of the 4 continental landmasses simultaneously. I want to be careful about what I mean when I say moving toward. This was not an advance in any military sense. The teams were mixed: institutional vehicles, research equipment, what appeared to be a combination of their uniformed service personnel and civilian specialists traveling together. They moved in the methodical pattern I had been watching for 28 rotations: organized, coordinated, purposeful, unhurried. They reached the first sensor cluster in approximately 6 hours. The sensor imagery before signal loss shows what happened. A vehicle stopped near a sensor unit. 4 HIV individuals emerged, wearing protective environmental suits, the kind their medical network had been distributing since Rotation 25, covering skin and respiratory passages, reducing exposure to the remaining atmospheric spore concentration. 2 carried sampling apparatus. 1 carried communications equipment. The 4th stood somewhat apart from the others, observing the work rather than participating in it. The one with the communications equipment appeared to be transmitting a continuous feed of what the others were doing. They found the first sensor in approximately 40 minutes. They did not damage it. They placed it in a sealed container with what appeared to be careful handling protocol. They loaded the container into their vehicle. They found all 7 sensors in that cluster over the course of 3 hours. I watched this on the backup orbital feed and filed a Priority 1 report noting that our ground sensor network was being systematically recovered by organized HIV teams, and that the recovery methodology suggested they had a model of our sensor placement logic. The detail about the communications feed was what I flagged most prominently. One of them was transmitting the entire recovery procedure to somewhere else in real time. Whatever they were learning from our hardware, they were sharing it immediately. Over the next 4 rotations, I tracked over 200 distinct team deployments across the continental surface. They were thorough. They did not rush. They recovered approximately 60% of our sensor network without damaging a single unit. Every sensor went into a sealed container. Every container went, based on the vehicle tracking I could manage from orbit, to the same category of destination: major HIV research institutions. They were not just collecting our sensors, they were building a collection. On rotation 56, secondary orbital sensor data showed an infrared signature consistent with a large-scale analytical facility running at high thermal output in one of the HIV's largest urban centers. The facility corresponded to what the Bureau had classified as one of their primary research universities, the same institution whose communications network had been running at maximum capacity since rotation 23, the same institution whose network activity had shown the first clear signature of counteragent development. The facility's thermal output profile was, by the standards of HIV institutional activity I had been monitoring, enormous. They were running something that required a great deal of energy. Based on the communications traffic flowing in and out, they were running it continuously, with no evident cessation or rest period across multiple rotations. I submitted what I believe was the most important report I filed during the entire operation on rotation 56. I am reproducing the key section here, because I want the record to contain it in full. The HIV have demonstrated, across the 56 rotations of this operation, a pattern of response that is not consistent with any of the 4 documented categories of species underseeding behavior in the Directorate's operational archive. Those categories are non-response, alarm and flee, alarm and fight, and adaptation failure. The HIV fit none of these. They identified the threat rapidly and without panic. They mobilized their analytical and medical institutions within days of initial exposure. They developed and distributed a biological counter-response within 30 rotations. They are now systematically recovering our intelligence infrastructure for the purpose of further analysis, transmitting that analysis in real time to their research network, and operating their analytical facilities at intensities that suggest this response is not slowing down but accelerating. The most important observation I can make in this report is not about a specific data point. It is about the pattern. Every response the HIV have made since rotation 23 has been faster than the previous one. Their counteragent development was faster than their initial biological modeling would have suggested was possible. Their sensor recovery was faster than their existing sensor detection capabilities would have predicted. Their atmospheric remediation ecosystem is spreading faster than the initial seeding rate suggested it could. The HIV are not just responding to the cascade operation. They are learning from it in real time, and each thing they learn makes them faster at the next thing. I believe this is the mechanism. The Class-17 biological classification of Vorrethian does not describe an incidental feature of the target world that poses logistical difficulty for the Directorate's landing teams. It describes the environment in which the HIV species evolved. They are not adapted to survive a Class-17 world. They are Class-17. The biological hostility of their world is not something they endure. It is something they absorbed across 400,000 cycles into their biology, their institutions, their practiced response protocols, and their collective scientific memory. When we seeded their atmosphere with a novel biological threat, we did not encounter a naive population that had never experienced anything like it. We encountered a species that has been encountering things like it, or rather things like the broad shape of it, invisible, hostile, requiring identification and counter-development, since before they built their first tools. We sent them something new to practice on. The practice is already complete. I am recommending immediate operational termination. Director Vorrethian marked the report, noted, monitoring continues. I continued monitoring. On rotation 59, Vorrethian came to my station. She didn't arrive with ceremony or a formal visit request. She simply appeared at the auxiliary chair beside mine, the observation chair that was never used sat down, and began reading my most recent atmospheric data directly from my display feed without asking permission. I let her. I had the sense she had been waiting for a reason to come by, and this was it. The numbers on my screen were not encouraging. The near-surface spore concentration had dropped to 11% of initial saturation. The counteragent ecosystem was consuming the remaining cascade at an accelerating rate. My projection model showed effective threshold clearance in approximately 7 more rotations. After that, the conversion agent would not exist below the stratospheric layer. The operation's entire biological mechanism would have been reduced to nothing by a world that had decided, collectively and efficiently, that it was a problem to be solved. Vorrethian looked at the projection curve for a long time. Then she said quietly, "They didn't fight us, they ate us." I said I understood the mechanism she was describing. She said that wasn't precisely what she meant. She meant it in a larger sense. The HIV response, she said, was not what a prey species does when confronted by a predator. Prey species fight or flee or hide. The HIV had done none of those things. What they had done was the thing that the top of a food chain does when something new appears in its environment that it doesn't recognize. It assesses the thing, determines what category of resource or threat it represents, incorporates whatever is useful, and eliminates whatever is not. We had sent them a biological agent calibrated to alter their cellular function. They had stripped the agent for parts, used what was chemically informative to build a countermodel, published that countermodel to their entire species, seeded a new microbiological ecosystem with the derived counteragent, and were now in the process of adding the entire interaction to their institutional scientific record. She said, "They've been doing this for 400,000 cycles on a world that was trying to kill them from every direction at once. We gave them something new to practice on, and they practiced on it." I asked her what she thought they would do with the sensor data they had recovered. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the planet on my feed rather than at me. Then she said she thought they would do with it what they had done with everything else we had sent them. Study it until they understood it completely, derive from it every piece of information about us that it could yield, and file it somewhere in that vast institutional scientific record, next to the counteragent profile for the cascade seed, to be retrieved and used whenever the information became relevant. She said, "The question is not what they'll do with it now. The question is what they'll do with it in 200 cycles." She paused, "or 400. I asked her what she thought that would look like. She said she didn't know. She said she was a xenobiologist, not a strategic analyst. She said what she could tell me was that the species had demonstrated it was capable of learning from things that tried to convert it, and using that learning proactively. That the organisms in their atmosphere were still evolving. That the institutional scientific record she had accessed in the literature search was not a passive archive, but an active working library that their researchers cited, built on, and used in real time. She said a species with that kind of biological memory, on a world like that one, had already survived everything their own planet had thrown at them. Then she said, "We weren't as different from the things their world has thrown at them as we thought we were." She left after that. I asked her what she thought they would do with the sensor data they had recovered. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the planet on my feed rather than at me. She said she thought they would do with it what they had done with everything else we had sent them. Study it until they understood it completely, derive from it every piece of information about us that it could yield, and file it somewhere in that vast institutional scientific record, next to the counteragent profile for the cascade seed, to be retrieved and used whenever the information became relevant. I asked her what she thought that would look like. She said she didn't know. She said she was a xenobiologist, not a strategic analyst. She said what she could tell me was that the species had demonstrated it was capable of learning from things that tried to convert it, and using that learning proactively. She said a species with that kind of biological memory, on a world like that one, had already survived everything their own planet had thrown at them. Then she said, we weren't as different from the things their world has thrown at them as we thought we were. She left after that. I watched the projection curve for a while longer, and then I went back to filing reports that no one was going to act on. On rotation 63, Director Vorrethian convened a second command session in the secondary command center, lower in the platform, no view of the planet below. A smaller room. He presented two options and asked for input from each of us in turn. I gave him the same analysis I had been giving him for 20 rotations, more concisely. Vorrethian gave him his military assessment of the landing force's prospects against an alert Class-17 world with a fully mobilized population and functional communications. Vorrethian gave him 3 additional findings. The first, the HIV had identified with reasonable confidence that whatever was deploying the atmospheric agent was operating from orbit. Their communications traffic in the last rotations showed directional references to the specific orbital band we were occupying, coupled with what appeared to be active observation and tracking activity from their surface-based sensor network. The second, the counteragent organisms they had seeded in the near-surface atmosphere were evolving. The microbial population was already showing genetic variation consistent with adaptation to the broader chemical environment, not just the cascade agent, which was nearly gone, but other atmospheric substrates. The organisms were generalizing. She could not predict what their capabilities would be in 10 cycles, or 20. She was not sure anyone could. The third, the HIV's operational history with novel biological threats across their recorded scientific literature showed 1,100 significant encounters. Counter-responses had been developed in all 1,100 cases. The median time from initial exposure to functional counter-response was 42 of their standard rotations. For our cascade agent, from initial atmospheric exposure to functional counter-response, they had taken 28. They had been faster than their own median. They were getting faster, even by their own historical standards, as they accumulated more practice. Vorrethian suspended the operation. He sent the withdrawal order to the dispersal platforms himself. He filed the operational termination report to Central Command personally, signing it directly rather than routing through the standard administrative channel. I was told later that this was unusual for an intelligence director. I was not surprised. He was, I believe, ensuring that his name was attached to the document, clearly and without ambiguity. I understood the instinct. I was not privy to Central Command's response. The termination filing was classified above my tier within the rotation. In the days after the withdrawal order, before the platform completed its transit out of the system, I spent a great deal of time watching Deathworld 9 on the orbital feed. The counteragent concentration continued to build even as the cascade agent itself declined toward the threshold of detection. The HIV communications network was running at 3 to 4 times its pre-operation baseline, not in alarm or mobilization patterns. In the pattern I had spent 50 rotations learning to read. The pattern that meant they were working, analyzing, building their understanding of something, adding it to the institutional record. The ground below was, by every instrument I had, a world that had encountered something it didn't understand and was in the process of thoroughly understanding it. Not angrily, not in triumph, with the same efficient, practiced, institutional methodology they had brought to bear on the 1,100 threats before this one. Deliberately, completely. I want to tell you what that looked like from orbit, because it is one of the things I keep returning to in the 239 rotations since. The planet had not changed visually. It was still mostly blue, the large landmasses gold-brown under the light from the local star, the atmospheric haze soft at the terminator line. The orbital sensor feeds showed the same cities and road networks and agricultural patterns I had been monitoring since before the operation began. Nothing about the visual record indicated that anything unusual had happened down there. The communications traffic was the difference. The volume and pattern of it carried on the electromagnetic spectrum our monitoring systems could read. It had the quality, and I am aware this is an unusual thing to say in a technical report, but I am trying to be accurate. It had the quality of urgency without panic. It was the traffic of a large, institutionally organized civilization doing what large, institutionally organized civilizations do when they have encountered a problem and decided it is their problem to solve. Gathering information, analyzing it, sharing the analysis, refining the model, and filing the results somewhere that other members of the civilization could access them and build on them. They were not done. They were nowhere near done. By the time we left sensor range, based on the volume and character of the traffic, they were deeper into the analysis than they had been on any previous rotation. They were going to be at this for a long time, and everything they produced was going to sit in that institutional record, alongside 1,100 other records of threats identified, modeled, and countered. I watched it until the platform's transit took us beyond clean sensor range, and then I watched the signal degrade, and then I watched it disappear. I want to be honest about one more thing before I close this report. In reviewing the HIV communications data from the full operation, the translation systems rendered one phrase that appeared across the early period traffic with high frequency and high confidence in multiple regional language variants. The phrase, in their primary communication language, translates as, "We've seen this before." Not us. Not the Vorrethian Directorate specifically. They had not encountered us before, had not known we existed until we seeded their atmosphere. But the shape of it, an invisible thing arriving in the air, in the water, carried on the wind, trying to alter them at the cellular level. That shape they had seen 1,100 times in their recorded history. They had institutional protocols for that shape. They had laboratories calibrated for that shape. They had a medical distribution network that had been, for 200 cycles of their own calendar, specifically designed to get a count response from the laboratory to the population as fast as biologically possible. When they said we've seen this before, they were right, they had. We had sent them the latest variant of something they had been practicing against for as long as they had been keeping records, and before that for as long as they had been alive, and before that for as long as their immune systems had been learning. We sent them something new to practice on. They practiced. This is the last report I am filing for Cascade Operation Vethmora 9. I am recommending, formally, that the Heathrack scale classification for Vethmora 9 be reviewed with urgency. The Class-17 biological hostility designation, in my assessment, fails to capture the operational reality of the target. The biological hostility of that world was not an external condition of the environment. It was the condition of the species. It had been accumulating in them for 400,000 cycles, and when we deployed the most sophisticated biological conversion tool in the Directorate's history against them, they processed it in 28 rotations and moved on to the next problem. I am recommending a minimum Class 19 designation. I am noting, for the record, that the Heathrack scale was not designed with a world like Vethmora 9 in mind. The Heathrack scale was designed by a civilization that had not previously attempted to seed a Class 17 world's dominant species, and had not previously encountered a species for which biological hostility was not an obstacle to survival but the source of it. I am also noting, because I believe the record should contain this, that the HIV's deep space probe is still outbound from their system. It was 19 cycles into its journey when we launched the Cascade. It is now 23 cycles out. It will take 1,400 more cycles to reach the nearest inhabited system at the speed it was moving when we last had sensor data on it. 1400 cycles is a very long time. The Directorate will have had time to determine what to do about what we learned on this operation, and what corrective measures, if any, to pursue. I want to be clear about what that probe represents, because I think it has been underweighted in every assessment of the HIV that I have read. It was launched by a species that did not know other spacefaring civilizations existed. They launched it anyway, into a void they knew was vast, at a speed they knew was slow, with a mission that none of the beings who built it would live to see completed. They did it because it was the next logical step in a process of outward investigation that had been underway since they first looked at the sky and decided they wanted to understand it. They are, in other words, a species that plans across timescales longer than any individual's life and executes those plans with institutional patience. They are also now a species that knows we exist, that knows someone came from orbit with a biological agent designed to alter their minds and make them compliant, that has samples of our hardware, our chemistry, and our deployment methodology in a laboratory somewhere in their largest research institution, being analyzed by the same institutional infrastructure that has successfully countered 1,100 previous biological threats. The probe will take 1400 cycles to reach another inhabited system. The HIV will need far less than 1400 cycles to understand what we sent them and build something based on it. I am requesting reassignment to a different sector. The review board has been sitting for 239 rotations without a formal finding. I understand why. There is no standard form for this outcome. There is no box in the operational filing system for what we encountered at Vethmora 9. There is no precedent, across 47 prior operations, for a seeding target that answered us. There will need to be a new box. My name is Kethserova, Sub-Analyst 3rd Tier, Vorrethian Directorate, Cascade Intelligence Division. This report covers Cascade Operation Vethmora 9, File number 441 Cascade 09. Status: Operation terminated without conversion, world unsecured, reclassification recommended, review pending, no date of resolution provided. I am done with this file.